Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones you can see. Sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places. Boone Cutter lived alone in Elkshade Forest, far from people and painful memories. One morning, a desperate mother wolf appeared at his cabin door with her dying pup. What she did next broke down every wall Boone had built around his heart. The old ranger thought his fighting days were over, but saving this little wolf would teach him that the greatest battles are fought with kindness. But what happened when the pup finally opened its eyes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn crept through the towering pines of Elkshade Forest like fingers of old gold, casting long shadows across the clearing where Boone Cutter's cabin stood. It was a sturdy thing, built with his own hands, from the timber of fallen giants, each log chosen with the careful eye of a man who understood that in this wilderness, everything had to last. The cabin sat in perfect solitude, 3 days' hard ride from the nearest settlement, where no law could reach and no stranger would dare venture without good reason. Boone emerged from the cabin's heavy oak door, his weathered boots stepping onto the wooden porch with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that sudden movements could mean the difference between life and death. At 58, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect in darker times, though now his only audience was the forest itself. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and his steel-blue eyes still held the sharpness that had once made him legendary among the Texas Rangers. The morning ritual never changed. First, the ceramic coffee cup, a simple thing with a chip on the handle that he'd grown fond of over the years. The cup had belonged to his late wife Martha, one of the few possessions he'd carried with him into this self-imposed exile. He filled it with strong black coffee from the pot that perpetually simmered on his wood stove, breathing in the familiar comfort of the bitter brew that had sustained him through countless mornings in hostile territory. Boone settled into the wooden chair he'd carved himself, positioned perfectly to survey the clearing and the forest beyond. This was his kingdom now, a realm of Douglas firs and mountain streams, where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through branches and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. He had chosen this place carefully, far from the memories that haunted the towns and cities where he'd once worn a badge with pride. The cabin itself told the story of a man who valued function over form. Inside, everything had its place. The rifle mounted above the fireplace, cleaned and oiled with military precision. Shelves lined with books on frontier medicine, animal behavior, and the philosophical writings of men who had also known solitude. And a simple kitchen where he prepared meals that sustained rather than delighted. There were no photographs, no mementos of his past life, nothing to remind him of the choices that had driven him to this remote sanctuary. His days followed a pattern as predictable as the sunrise. After coffee, he would check the snares he'd set for rabbits. Not because he needed the meat, his garden and the occasional deer provided enough, but because the routine gave structure to hours that might otherwise drift away like smoke. Then came the maintenance, splitting wood, mending whatever the harsh mountain weather had damaged, tending to the small vegetable garden that provided carrots, potatoes, and beans through the growing season. Boone had been a different man once. Captain Boone Cutter of the Texas Rangers, they'd called him, a lawman with a reputation for bringing in the worst of the worst, alive when possible, dead when necessary. He'd ridden with men who trusted him with their lives, had pursued outlaws across desert and mountain, had stood between civilization and chaos for more than 2 decades. His hands, now calloused from honest labor, had once been just as comfortable drawing iron as they were now wielding an axe. But that life had ended 3 years ago on a dusty street in El Paso, when a decision made in split seconds had cost an innocent life. The official inquiry had cleared him. The shooting was justified, they said. A tragic but unavoidable consequence of the chaos that erupted when the Dalton gang had tried to rob the First National Bank. But Boone knew the truth that the inquiry couldn't capture. In that moment when lead was flying and smoke filled the air, he had hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of too many similar moments. Too many faces that visited him in the dark hours before dawn. The young schoolteacher, Miss Emily Harper, had been crossing the street to reach her students when the shooting started. She'd been caught in the crossfire, struck down by a ricochet from Boone's own gun. 23 years old, with dreams of teaching children to read and write, she died in the dust while chaos reigned around her. The official report called it an accident of war, collateral damage in the pursuit of justice. Boone called it the day he stopped believing he deserved to wear a badge, so he'd ridden north, following old game trails and forgotten paths until he found this place where the mountains kept their secrets and the forest offered forgiveness to those willing to earn it. He'd built his cabin with his own hands, cutting and shaping each log, as if the physical labor could somehow balance the scales of what he'd taken from the world. Here his only judgment came from the elements, his only duty to himself, and the wild things that shared his domain. The forest had accepted him gradually, the way it accepted all things that proved worthy of its trust. At first, the wildlife had given his clearing a wide berth, sensing the scent of civilization and violence that clung to him like smoke. But as the seasons passed, and Boone proved himself a respectful neighbor, the deer began to graze at the edge of his garden. Foxes denned within sight of his porch, and occasionally a black bear would lumber through his clearing with the casual indifference of true ownership. He'd learned their languages, the warning chatter of squirrels when strangers approached, the territorial calls of the great horned owls that ruled the night, the subtle signs that spoke of weather changes days before they arrived. This knowledge had become as natural to him as reading sign had been in his ranger days, but it carried none of the deadly urgency that had once driven him from dawn to dusk. The isolation suited him. There were no deputies to train, no outlaws to pursue, no sheriff seeking his counsel on matters of law and order. His conversations were with the wind in the pines and the crackling of his evening fire. He read extensively, philosophy, natural history, and the occasional novel that reminded him that there were still stories being lived beyond these mountains. But mostly, he simply existed in the rhythm of seasons, watching the forest change from the bright green of spring through the golden glory of autumn to the stark beauty of winter snow. Some might have called it a lonely life, but Boone had discovered that solitude and loneliness were different creatures entirely. Loneliness was what he'd felt in crowded saloons and busy sheriff's offices, surrounded by people who knew his reputation but not his heart. Solitude was this: the peaceful certainty that came with knowing his place in the natural order, the satisfaction of work done with his own hands, the deep contentment that settled over him each evening as he watched the sun disappear behind the western peaks. His neighbors, such as they were, existed only in his memory now. There was Sam McCready, who ran the trading post in Pine Ridge, 3 days south. A good man who asked no questions when Boone appeared twice a year to trade furs for coffee, salt, and ammunition. Old Henrik the trapper, who had died the previous winter, but whose cabin still stood empty 2 valleys over, had been the closest thing to a friend Boone had known in these mountains. They'd shared perhaps a dozen conversations over 2 years, but each had been worth more than hours of empty chatter. The morning when everything changed began like all the others. Boone rose before dawn, built up the fire, and set the coffee to brew. He stepped onto his porch with his chipped ceramic cup, breathing in the crisp mountain air that carried the promise of an early autumn. The clearing lay peaceful in the growing light, familiar and reassuring in its unchanging character. It was then that he heard something that shouldn't have been there, a sound so faint and unexpected that he almost dismissed it as imagination. A low whine, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pines. Boone set down his coffee cup and listened with the trained attention of a man who had survived by noticing what others missed. There it was again. Not the wind, not the settling of wood in the cooling cabin, but something alive and in distress. Boone's hand instinctively moved toward where his sidearm would have hung in the old days, but found only empty air. He'd packed away his guns 3 years ago, keeping only the hunting rifle for necessity and protection. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't human. No person could approach his clearing without triggering a dozen natural alarms that would have reached his ears long before any voice could. The sound came again, closer now, accompanied by the soft brush of careful footsteps in the underbrush. Boone remained perfectly still, letting his eyes scan the tree line while his ears sorted through the subtle symphony of forest sounds. Something was moving out there, something that belonged to the wild, but was approaching his domain with purpose rather than accident. As the light grew stronger and the familiar shapes of his clearing emerged from shadow, Boone saw movement at the edge of the forest. What emerged from between the dark trunks of the pines was a sight that stopped his breath and opened a door in his heart he'd thought was sealed forever. She was a grey wolf, but the morning light revealed the harsh truth of her condition. Her ribs showed stark against her matted coat, and her usually proud bearing was bent with exhaustion and desperation. What struck Boone most powerfully wasn't her obvious hunger or the wild look in her amber eyes. It was what she carried in her mouth with the tender care that only a mother could understand. The pup was limp, barely larger than a man's 2 hands, its small body hanging motionless from its mother's gentle grip. Even from 30 yards away, Boone could see that the little one was more dead than alive, its fur dull and lifeless, tiny chest barely rising with breath so shallow it might have been imagination. The mother wolf had traveled far with this burden, her paws worn raw and bleeding, her strength clearly at its limit. What happened next defied everything Boone thought he knew about wild creatures and their relationship with man. Instead of fleeing when she spotted him standing motionless on his porch, the wolf stopped at the edge of his clearing and simply stood there, meeting his eyes across the distance. In that gaze, Boone saw something that cut through his careful defenses like a blade through cloth. Pure, desperate hope. The wolf took 3 careful steps into the clearing, then set her pup down on the soft earth with infinite gentleness. She nudged the still form with her nose, and when it didn't respond, she looked back at Boone with an expression that transcended species. It was a look he'd seen before, in the eyes of mothers holding dying children, in the faces of men whose partners had been shot down beside them. It was the look of someone who had tried everything and was now asking for a miracle. Boone felt his heart crack open like an egg struck against stone. This wild creature, who should have fled at the first scent of human presence, was instead offering her most precious possession to a stranger. She was asking him, a man who had failed to save those under his protection before, to somehow work magic that she could not, without conscious thought. Boone stepped down from his porch and began walking slowly toward the wolf and her pup. Every instinct from his ranger days screamed warnings about approaching wild predators, but something deeper than training guided his movements. The wolf watched his approach without moving, her body tense but not aggressive, ready to grab her pup and flee if necessary, but willing to trust just a little longer. When Boone was 10 feet away, he stopped and slowly knelt on one knee, making himself smaller and less threatening. The wolf's ears flicked nervously, but she held her ground. Up close, Boone could see the full extent of her desperation, the hollowed cheeks, the dull coat that spoke of weeks without proper food. The way she swayed slightly on her feet from exhaustion. "Easy now, Mama," Boone said softly, his voice carrying the same tone he'd once used to calm spooked horses and frightened children. "I see what you're asking. I see your little one." The pup was in worse condition than he'd feared. Its breathing was so shallow that Boone had to watch for nearly a minute to confirm there was any life left at all. The small body felt cold to the touch when he gently ran his finger along its side, and he could feel the sharp outline of ribs beneath the thin fur. Whatever had brought mother and child to this desperate state, they were running out of time. Boone looked up into the wolf's eyes again, and what he saw there made his decision for him. "All right, Mama. All right," "We'll try." Moving with deliberate slowness, Boone reached out and carefully lifted the pup from the ground. The wolf tensed and took a half step forward, a low growl rumbling in her throat. But when Boone cradled the small form against his chest with obvious care, she settled back, watching his every movement with fierce attention. The pup was barely alive. Its body temperature was far too low, its heartbeat so faint that Boone had to press his ear against the tiny chest to detect it. But there was still life there, still a chance if he acted quickly and with the right knowledge. Years of frontier experience had taught him basic veterinary skills. Every man who lived beyond civilization learned to doctor animals as well as people, or he didn't survive long. "Come on then," Boone said to the wolf, who had begun to follow him toward the cabin. "We'll see what we can do." Inside the cabin, Boone moved with purpose born of crisis. He built up the fire until heat radiated from the stone hearth, then prepared a nest of soft blankets near the warmth. The wolf had followed him to the doorway, but wouldn't cross the threshold. The scent of human habitation was still too foreign, too threatening for complete trust. Boone placed the pup in the warm nest and began his examination. The little one was severely dehydrated and malnourished, its gums pale and dry, its tiny body limp with weakness. But the heartbeat, though faint, was steady, and when Boone gently opened one small eyelid, the pupil contracted slightly in response to light. There was still fight left in this small creature, working from memory and instinct. Boone prepared a mixture of warm water with a small amount of honey and salt, a solution he'd used before to revive animals suffering from exposure and starvation. Using a small spoon, he began to drip the mixture between the pup's lips, massaging its throat gently to encourage swallowing. The wolf watched from the doorway, her body rigid with tension, but her eyes fixed on every movement of Boone's hands. When the pup gave a tiny cough and swallowed a few drops of the mixture, the wolf's ears pricked forward and she took another step closer to the threshold. "That's it, little one," Boone murmured, continuing to administer the life-giving fluid drop by drop. "Come on back to us." For the next hour, Boone worked with the patience of a man who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. He warmed the pup's body with gentle massage, continued to give it small amounts of the restorative mixture, and gradually saw signs of improvement. The breathing became slightly stronger, the heartbeat more detectable, and once, just once, the pup's tail gave the faintest twitch. The wolf never left her post at the doorway, and as the morning wore on, Boone became aware that she too was in desperate need of care. He could see the exhaustion in every line of her body, the way she swayed on her feet, the hollow look that spoke of sacrifice beyond human understanding. During a moment when the pup seemed stable, Boone stepped away and returned with a bowl of water and some dried meat from his stores. He placed them just outside the cabin door, close enough for the wolf to reach, but far enough to respect her wild nature. She drank deeply, desperately, then tore into the meat with the hunger of the starving. As she ate, Boone noticed details that told a story of hardship and determination. Her paws were cracked and bleeding from long travel over rough ground. Her coat bore scars from encounters with other predators, or perhaps barbed wire from distant ranches. This was a mother who had traveled far and endured much to bring her dying child to the only help she could find. The most remarkable thing was the trust she was slowly extending. By afternoon, she had moved closer to the cabin door, and when Boone spoke to her in gentle tones, her ears would prick forward as if she were trying to understand his words. When he worked with the pup, she would stretch her neck to see better, never interfering, but clearly invested in every small sign of progress. As the sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the western peaks, Boone felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 3 years. It was the feeling of being needed, of having a purpose beyond mere survival. This wild creature had chosen to trust him with her most precious gift, and that trust was awakening parts of his soul he'd thought were buried forever with his badge and his past. The pup stirred in its warm nest. and for the first time since morning opened its eyes, dark blue gems that looked around with the confused curiosity of the very young. The wolf saw it too, and a sound escaped her throat that was part whine, part cry of relief, part song of gratitude. Boone knelt beside the nest and gently stroked the pup's head with one finger. "Welcome back, little one," he whispered. "Your mama brought you a long way to get here." At the sound of his voice, the pup turned its head toward him, and in that simple gesture, Boone understood that his life of solitude had just ended forever. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of care and vigilance that Boone hadn't known since his early years as a young ranger, when every decision could mean life or death. The wolf pup, he'd taken to calling him Scout in his mind, required feeding every few hours, and Boone found himself waking before dawn not from habit, but from the soft whimpers that signaled hunger or discomfort. He'd fashioned a makeshift bottle from a small glass vial and a piece of soft leather, creating a nursing system that allowed him to feed Scout a mixture of warm goat's milk, obtained from a trading expedition to Sam McCrady's post, mixed with egg yolk and a touch of honey. The pup took to it eagerly, his tiny paws kneading against Boone's hands as he fed, a gesture so innocent and trusting that it never failed to tighten something in the old ranger's chest, the mother wolf, whom Boone had begun thinking of as Luna for her habit of appearing ghost-like in the moonlight, maintained her vigil from just outside the cabin. She'd grown bolder over the first week, moving closer to the door during feeding times, her amber eyes never leaving her son as Boone administered care with hands that had once been more familiar with gun leather than gentle healing. What struck Boone most profoundly was how natural this felt. The careful measuring of milk, the gentle warming by the fire, the patient coaxing when Scout was too weak to nurse properly. These tasks filled his days with purpose in a way that chopping wood and tending his garden never had. There was something deeply satisfying about watching the pup grow stronger each day, about seeing the dull fur begin to show hints of its true silver-gray color, about feeling the tiny body grow warmer and more solid in his hands. On the third day, Scout opened his eyes fully for the first time and focused on Boone's face with the startling intelligence that marked his kind. Those dark blue eyes, which would likely change to amber as he matured, seemed to study Boone with an intensity that was both endearing and slightly unnerving. It was as if the pup was memorizing every detail of the man who had become his surrogate father. Boone found himself talking to Scout during their feeding sessions, his voice taking on the gentle cadence he'd once used with nervous horses. "There's a good boy," he'd murmur as Scout nursed eagerly. "Your mama did right bringing you here. She's got good sense, that one. Knew where to find help when she needed it." Luna seemed to understand these one-sided conversations. Her ears would prick forward when Boone spoke, and occasionally she would make soft sounds in response, as if adding her own commentary to the situation. The three of them were developing a strange sort of family dynamic that both comforted and concerned the former lawman. The concern came from a growing awareness that this arrangement couldn't last forever. Scout was a wild creature, born to run free in the forest with his pack. Luna was a predator who belonged to the wilderness, not lingering at the edges of human habitation. Sooner or later, they would need to return to their natural lives, and Boone would once again be alone, with only his memories for company. But for now, he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the immediate needs of his unusual charges. He researched wolf behavior in the books he'd accumulated over the years, learning about pack structure, hunting patterns, and the complex social bonds that defined lupine families. What he read both fascinated and worried him. Wolves were not dogs, and despite their current dependence on his care, they were fundamentally wild animals with instincts and needs that domestic life could never fully satisfy. The first major challenge came on the 5th day, when Scout began to show signs of restlessness that went beyond simple hunger or discomfort. The pup would whine and squirm in his nest by the fire, his tiny nose working constantly as if searching for something Boone couldn't provide. When Luna heard these distress sounds, she would pace back and forth outside the cabin, her own anxiety clearly rising. Boone realized that Scout needed contact with his mother, not just the visual confirmation that she was nearby, but the physical comfort that only Luna could provide. The problem was that Luna still wouldn't enter the cabin fully, and Scout was too weak to be taken outside for extended periods. The solution came to him while he sat on his porch that evening, watching Luna patrol the perimeter of his clearing like a sentry on duty. If Luna wouldn't come inside, perhaps he could bring the inside out. Working by lantern light, Boone constructed a small shelter against the side of his cabin, a lean-to structure with 3 walls and an opening that faced the forest. He lined it with soft blankets and positioned it so that it would stay warm. From the cabin's chimney, while remaining open enough for Luna to enter and exit as she pleased. When he carried Scout to this new arrangement the next morning, the effect was immediate and profound. Luna approached cautiously at first, her nose working to assess this new situation. But when she heard Scout's eager whimpers, maternal instinct overcame caution. She slipped into the shelter and, for the first time in nearly a week, was able to nuzzle her son directly. The reunion was heartbreaking and beautiful to witness. Luna licked Scout's fur with the methodical care of a mother, confirming that her child was truly safe and healthy. Scout responded by nuzzling against her, his tiny tail wagging with an enthusiasm that brought an unexpected smile to Boone's weathered face. The 2 wolves communicated in ways that went far beyond human understanding. Soft sounds, gentle touches, a complex language of scent and instinct that reminded Boone of his own profound isolation. This new arrangement brought unexpected benefits. Luna began to stay closer to the cabin, no longer feeling the need to maintain her patrol of the clearing's perimeter. She would curl up next to Scout in the shelter during the day, sharing her body heat and providing the comfort that only a mother could give. At night, she would venture into the forest to hunt, returning before dawn with the satisfaction of a successful predator and the dedication of a parent who would never abandon her young. Boone found his own routines adapting to accommodate his new responsibilities. He would check on Scout and Luna first thing each morning, bringing warm milk and ensuring that the shelter remained clean and comfortable. During the day, he would sit nearby while he worked on small projects, mending tools, preparing winter supplies, reading from his collection of books. His presence seemed to comfort both wolves, and he discovered that he enjoyed the companionship more than he'd expected. In the evenings, after Scout had been fed and settled for the night, Boone would sit on his porch and find himself talking to Luna as she rested in the shelter. He'd tell her about his day, about the weather patterns he'd observed, about memories from his past that he'd never shared with another living soul. Luna would listen with the attention of a good friend, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight from inside the cabin, occasionally responding with soft sounds that seemed remarkably like conversation. It was during one of these evening talks that Boone first spoke aloud about Martha, his late wife, and the children they'd never been able to have. The words came slowly, painfully, but somehow it felt right to share these private griefs with a creature who offered no judgment, only silent understanding. "We tried for years," he found himself saying, as Luna watched him from the shelter. "Martha would have loved this, taking care of your little one. She had the gentlest hands, could nurse a bird back to health or calm a frightened horse just by talking to it soft and low." Luna's ears perked forward, as if she understood the sadness in his voice, and she made a low sound that was neither whine nor growl, but something uniquely comforting. In that moment, Boone realized that healing was happening for all 3 of them, Scout growing stronger each day, Luna finding rest and security after her desperate journey, and Boone himself beginning to feel whole in ways he'd forgotten were possible. 2 weeks into their unlikely arrangement, Scout had transformed from the dying pup who'd been carried to Boone's door into a creature of startling vitality and mischief. His fur had filled out to reveal the distinctive markings of his kind, dark guard hairs along his back and shoulders, lighter silver-grey on his sides, and the characteristic white markings on his chest, and paws that would help Luna identify him from a distance as he grew. But it was Scout's personality that truly captivated Boone. The pup had developed a fearless curiosity about everything in his expanding world, from the patterns of light and shadow cast by the cabin's windows to the fascinating array of scents that drifted from Boone's cooking pot. He would tumble and play in the shelter with an energy that seemed impossible for something that had been so close to death such a short time ago. The leather pouch that had once held Boone's ranger badge became Scout's favorite toy. Boone had discovered it while organizing his belongings, and on impulse, he'd offered it to the pup during a particularly restless afternoon. Scout had pounced on it immediately, wrestling with the soft leather and shaking it with the fierce determination of a predator 10 times his size. The sight of this tiny wolf attacking his old badge with such enthusiasm struck Boone as profoundly symbolic, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Luna watched these play sessions with the patient amusement of a mother who understood that her child's energy was a sign of returning health. She would occasionally join in, batting gently at Scout with her massive paws, or engaging in mock wrestling matches that always ended with Scout triumphantly standing on his mother's head, his tiny tail wagging with pride. These moments of joy were punctuated by reminders of the challenges that lay ahead. Scout was growing rapidly, his appetite increasing daily, and his natural instincts were beginning to assert themselves. He would cock his head at sounds from the forest that were inaudible to human ears, his tiny nose working constantly to decode the complex messages carried on every breeze. Boone could see the wild creature emerging within the playful pup, and he knew that their time together was measured in weeks rather than months. The first serious complication arose when Scout began attempting to follow Luna on her nightly hunting expeditions. The pup was far too young and small to keep up with his mother's ranging, but his instincts drove him to try. On 3 separate occasions, Boone had awakened to find Scout missing from the shelter, only to discover him a few hundred yards into the forest, crying pitifully as he tried to follow a scent trail that had long since grown cold. These incidents terrified Luna, who would spend frantic minutes searching for her missing son before finding him and carrying him back to safety. The stress was clearly wearing on her. Boone could see it in the way she paced before leaving each night, torn between her need to hunt and her maternal instinct to protect Scout from his own adventurous spirit. The solution required careful thought and planning. Boone constructed a larger enclosure adjacent to the shelter, using salvaged materials and his own considerable carpentry skills. The pen was spacious enough for Scout to play and exercise safely, but secure enough to prevent his nocturnal wandering. He lined it with soft earth and provided various objects for entertainment: smooth stones for batting around, sturdy sticks for chewing, and a small log that served as both obstacle and throne for a young wolf learning to navigate his world. Luna inspected the new arrangement with the thoroughness of a mother ensuring her child's safety. She tested every corner, every potential weakness, even attempting to dig beneath the barriers to confirm that Scout couldn't escape through tunnels of his own making. Only when she was satisfied did she allow Scout to explore his new domain. The enclosure proved to be a perfect solution. Scout could exercise and play to his heart's content while Luna hunted, and both could rest easy knowing that curious paws wouldn't lead to dangerous midnight adventures. More importantly, it provided Scout with a controlled environment where he could begin to develop the physical skills he would need as an adult wolf. Boone found himself spending hours watching Scout's development, fascinated by the emergence of behaviors that were clearly instinctual rather than learned. The pup would practice pouncing on imaginary prey, his form improving daily as genetic programming overrode inexperience. He learned to use his voice, progressing from puppy whimpers to experimental howls that would someday carry for miles across the forest. These miniature howls created an unexpected problem. On the third night that Scout attempted his vocal exercises, Boone was awakened by answering calls from the deep forest, long, mournful sounds that spoke of recognition and invitation. Luna immediately grew agitated, pacing the perimeter of the clearing and adding her own voice to the distant chorus. Boone understood what was happening. Word was spreading through the wolf community that Luna and her pup were safe and thriving. Other wolves were calling to them, seeking to re-establish the pack bonds that Luna's desperate journey had severed. For wolves, family was everything, and Scout's healthy calls were an announcement that the future of their line was secure. The implications were both wonderful and heartbreaking. Luna's pack hadn't abandoned her. They'd been searching, calling, hoping for exactly this news. But their summons also meant that the time for departure was drawing near. Scout was strong enough now to travel, and Luna's wild heart was responding to the call of her own kind. Boone felt the approaching separation like a physical weight in his chest. These two creatures had awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried. The capacity to love without reservation, to care for another living being with complete devotion. The irony wasn't lost on him that it had taken wild animals to teach him how to be human again. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret the experience. Every day with Scout and Luna had been a gift, even knowing it was temporary. He'd watched life return to something that was dying, had felt useful and needed in ways that transcended his old profession. If this was all he was granted, these few weeks of purpose and companionship, it was more than he dared hope for when he'd first retreated to this mountain. Sanctuary, but the forest calls continued each night, growing more frequent and more insistent. Luna's responses grew stronger, more confident, filled with the complex information that wolves shared across vast distances. She was telling her pack that she would return, that her son was safe and strong, that their family would soon be whole again. Scout seemed to understand some of this communication, even at his young age. He would grow quiet during the evening chorus, his head tilted as he listened to voices that carried messages far more complex than simple location. Boone could see the wild nature asserting itself more strongly each day, could feel the approaching moment when maternal instinct and pack loyalty would overcome the gratitude that had brought them to his door. As he sat on his porch that evening, listening to the distant calls and watching Luna pace restlessly in the clearing, Boone made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. When the time came for them to leave, and he knew it would come soon, he wouldn't try to hold them back. His gift to Scout and Luna would be letting them go, even though it would leave him more alone than ever before. The change began on a crisp morning in early October, when the aspen leaves had turned to gold, and the air carried the sharp promise of winter. Boone awoke to find Luna standing at the very edge of his clearing, her body rigid with attention as she stared into the deep forest. Scout was pressed against the fence of his enclosure, his small body trembling with excitement as he too focused on something beyond human perception. Then Boone heard it, a howl unlike the distant calls they'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks. This was closer, much closer, carrying a complexity of meaning that spoke of pack hierarchy and family bonds. It was answered immediately by Luna, her voice rising in a song of recognition and joy that made the hair on Boone's arms stand up. Within minutes, the forest began to yield its secrets. First came a massive male, his coat a deep charcoal gray that marked him as an alpha wolf in his prime. He moved with the confident authority of a leader, but his approach to Luna was gentle, almost reverent. When they touched noses in greeting, Boone understood that this was Scout's father, returning after what must have been weeks of searching for his lost. Her family. Behind the alpha came two other wolves, a younger male with the lean build of a hunter and a female whose silver coat and wise eyes suggested she was Luna's mother or aunt. They formed a loose semicircle at the tree line, close enough to demonstrate their peaceful intentions but far enough to avoid triggering any defensive instincts in the human who had sheltered their packmates. Scout's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The pup threw himself against the fence of his enclosure, whimpering and yipping with desperate excitement as he tried to reach these newcomers who represented everything his instincts told him was home and family. His small voice cracked as he attempted howls that were still more puppy than wolf, but the pack responded to each attempt with encouraging sounds that needed no translation. Luna moved between her son and her pack, her body language a complex display of conflicting emotions. Joy at being reunited with her family warred with protective instincts toward the human who had saved her pup's life. She would approach the fence to nuzzle Scout reassuringly, then return to the pack for brief exchanges of information that sounded like urgent conversations. Boone watched this reunion from his porch, feeling like an intruder at a family gathering, while simultaneously experiencing a profound sense of completion. This was how it was supposed to be. Scout surrounded by his own kind, Luna no longer bearing the terrible weight of being a pack of one. The sight filled him with satisfaction even as it carved a hollow space in his chest. The alpha wolf, whom Boone had begun thinking of as Titan for his impressive size and bearing, seemed particularly interested in studying the human who had cared for his family. Those intelligent amber eyes assessed Boone with an intensity that felt almost like being evaluated. There was no hostility in that gaze, but there was a clear question. Could this human be trusted with the welfare of pack members? Over the next several hours, Boone had his answer. The pack began a careful approach, led by Luna herself, as she demonstrated the safety of the clearing. First came tentative explorations of the area immediately around Scout's enclosure, then gradual movement toward the cabin itself. By midday, all 4 adult wolves were resting in the shade of Boone's porch, while Scout entertained them from his pen with displays of the tricks and behaviors he'd learned during his recovery. What amazed Boone most was the pack's obvious gratitude. Wolves were not domestic animals. They didn't show appreciation in ways humans easily recognized, but their behavior spoke volumes to anyone who understood their nature. They could have simply collected Scout and Luna and disappeared into the forest. Instead, they lingered, allowing Boone to observe their family dynamics and clearly demonstrating their acceptance of his role in their story. Titan proved to be especially remarkable. The big male would position himself where he could watch both Scout and Boone simultaneously, his body language suggesting deep thought rather than simple vigilance. When Boone moved around the clearing tending to his daily tasks, Titan's eyes would follow with the attention of someone taking mental notes. It was as if the alpha was learning everything he could about the human who had earned such trust from his mate. The pack's hunting strategy became apparent as the day progressed. The younger male and the older female would disappear into the forest for hours at a time, returning with fresh meat that they would share with Luna while she remained near Scout. This allowed her to maintain her strength without leaving her pup, a sophisticated social arrangement that spoke to the deep intelligence that governed wolf society. But it was Scout himself who provided the most telling evidence of the changes taking place. In the presence of his pack, the pup's behavior shifted dramatically. His play became more focused, more purposeful, as he demonstrated skills that would be essential for survival in the wild. He practiced stalking imaginary prey with movements that were startlingly adult in their precision. His vocalizations grew stronger and more varied, developing the range of sounds he would need to communicate across the vast distances that separated pack members during hunts. Most significantly, Scout began to show clear preferences for wolf company over human interaction. When Boone approached the enclosure during the pack's visit, Scout would acknowledge him with the brief attention due to a friend, but his real focus remained on the adults of his own species. He was learning their language, their customs, their ways of being in the world, education that no human could provide. No matter how well-intentioned, the realization that Scout was ready to leave came to Boone gradually, like the slow recognition of approaching winter. The pup was strong, healthy, and eager to join his family's nomadic life. Luna had demonstrated that she trusted Boone completely, but her wild heart belonged to the forest and the pack that provided both safety and purpose. Even Titans seemed to understand that their debt to this human could never be fully repaid, but that the time for dwelling at the edges of civilization was coming to an end. On the third day of the pack's visit, Boone made a decision that felt both inevitable and heartbreaking. He would open Scout's enclosure and let the pup choose his own path. If Scout chose to stay with his human friend, Boone would continue caring for him as long as necessary. If he chose to join his pack and embrace his wild heritage, Boone would wish him well and treasure the memory of their time together. As evening approached and the pack gathered near the enclosure for what felt like a final conference, Boone fetched the old leather pouch that had become Scout's favorite toy. He'd made his decision about more than just opening a gate. He was ready to let go of the past that the pouch represented and embrace whatever future awaited him. The setting sun painted the clearing in shades of gold and amber as Boone approached the enclosure where Scout waited. Surrounded by his family, poised between two worlds and ready to choose the one that would define the rest of his life. Boone's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the latch of Scout's enclosure. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. He was about to release not just a wolf pup, but the last connection to a purpose that had given his life meaning for the first time in 3 years. The pack watched in absolute silence, their amber eyes reflecting the dying light as they waited to see what choice Scout would make. The latch clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed clearing. Scout looked up at Boone with those intelligent dark eyes, then at the open gate, then at his family waiting beyond. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the pup remained motionless, as if he too understood the weight of this decision. Then Scout did something that surprised everyone present. Instead of rushing toward his pack or lingering in his familiar enclosure, he walked slowly to where Boone knelt and pressed his small head against the man's weathered hand. It was a gesture of gratitude and farewell, a moment of connection that transcended species and spoke to the deep bond they'd forged during their time together. Boone gently stroked Scout's fur one last time, memorizing the feel of it beneath his fingers. "Go on, boy," he whispered. "Your family's waiting for you." Scout stepped back, looked once more into Boone's eyes, then trotted with growing confidence toward Luna and the pack. The reunion was immediate and joyful, gentle nips and nudges as the adults welcomed the pup into their fold. Soft sounds of encouragement and recognition that spoke of acceptance and belonging. But what happened next left Boone speechless with wonder. Instead of melting away into the forest as he'd expected, the pack lingered. Titan approached the cabin with deliberate steps, carrying something in his massive jaws, a freshly killed rabbit, still warm and clearly intended as an offering. He placed it carefully at Boone's feet, then stepped back and dipped his great head in what could only be described as a bow of respect. One by one, the other pack members followed suit. The younger male brought a collection of choice bones, cleaned and selected with obvious care. The older female offered a bundle of herbs in her mouth, plants that Boone recognized as having medicinal properties, gathered with the knowledge that only wild creatures possessed about the healing power of forest vegetation. Luna's gift was the most precious of all. She approached, carrying something that made Boone's heart skip, a small pine cone perfectly formed and still green with the promise of new growth. She placed it gently beside the other offerings, then touched her nose briefly to Boone's hand before stepping back to rejoin her family. The meaning was unmistakable. This was not goodbye, it was initiation. The pack was welcoming Boone into their extended family, acknowledging him as someone who had earned their trust and respect. In wolf society, such acceptance was rare and precious, extended only to those who had proven themselves worthy of pack loyalty. Titan's final gesture sealed this new relationship. The alpha wolf threw back his great head and released a howl that echoed across the mountains, not a call of departure, but one of announcement. He was telling every wolf within hearing that this place, this clearing, this human, was under pack protection. Any wolf who heard that call would know that Boone Cutter was friend, not foe. Scout added his own small voice to his father's song. And soon the entire pack was singing together in the ancient harmony that had echoed through these mountains for countless generations. But now that song included a new verse, recognition of the bond between wild and civilized, predator and protector, wolf and man. As the howling died away and night settled over the clearing, the pack began to move toward the forest. But their departure was gradual, reluctant, filled with backward glances that suggested this was not the ending Boone had anticipated. Scout lingered longest of all, torn between his instinct to follow his family and his affection for the man who had saved his life. Finally, Luna returned to collect her son, gently nudging him toward the trees. But before they disappeared into the darkness, she looked back at Boone one final time. In that amber gaze, he saw something that made his breath catch, a promise. This was not goodbye. It was, until we meet again. The forest swallowed them as completely as if they had never existed, leaving only the echo of their passage and the precious gifts they'd left behind. Boone stood alone in his clearing, surrounded by offerings that represented acceptance into a society he'd never imagined joining. Over the following days, Boone discovered that his relationship with the pack was far from over. They had claimed him as family, and wolves took care of family. Fresh meat would appear near his cabin, choice cuts left where he would find them easily. His garden, which had often suffered from deer and rabbit predation, was now mysteriously protected. Any creature that might damage his crops quickly learned that this territory was guarded by hunters far more formidable than any human. The pack's territory apparently extended in a protective circle around Boone's clearing. He would sometimes catch glimpses of them patrolling the perimeter, their presence as comforting as it was awe-inspiring. The sounds of the forest changed too, the confident calls of the pack as they moved through their domain, the answering songs from other wolves acknowledging their authority. Most remarkably, Scout would visit, never approaching too close, but near enough for Boone to see how rapidly he was growing and learning. The pup was becoming a young wolf with startling speed, his movements more graceful each time Boone glimpsed him. But those visits carried a message of their own. Scout had not forgotten the man who had saved his life. The pine cone that Luna had gifted him became Boone's most treasured possession. He planted it in a place of honor near his cabin, watering it carefully and protecting it from harsh weather. As it began to sprout, a tiny green shoot reaching toward the sky, it represented something profound, new growth, new life, new possibilities that he'd thought were beyond his reach. Winter was coming to the mountains, bringing challenges that would test both man and wolf. But for the first time in 3 years, Boone faced the approaching cold season, not as a solitary hermit, but as part of something larger than himself. He was pack now, claimed and protected by creatures who understood loyalty in its purest form. The old leather pouch that had once held his ranger badge still lay where Scout had last played with it. But it no longer seemed like a relic of a failed past. Instead, it had become a symbol of transformation, from badge of human authority to toy for a wolf pup to marker of a bond that transcended the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. As Boone prepared for winter, he found himself planning not just for his own survival, but for the welfare of his extended pack family. The man who had come to these mountains to escape human connection had discovered something infinitely more profound: acceptance into the ancient society that had ruled these forests since time immemorial. The first snow of winter had been falling for 3 days when Boone heard the sound that changed everything. The distant crack of gunfire echoing across the mountains like breaking bones. He'd been splitting wood near his cabin when the shots rang out, multiple rifles firing in rapid succession, followed by an ominous silence that made his blood run cold. Those weren't hunting shots. Boone had heard enough gunfights in his ranger days to recognize the difference between a hunter taking game and men shooting to kill. The pattern was wrong, the timing too frantic. the volume too great for anything except armed conflict. And it was coming from the direction where he'd last seen Scout and the pack. Without conscious thought, Boone dropped his axe and ran for his cabin. His hands moved with the muscle memory of 30 years, as he retrieved the rifle he'd packed away 3 years ago, checking the action and loading it with practiced efficiency. The weight of the weapon felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like greeting an old friend who brought unwelcome news. As he emerged from the cabin, the forest erupted with the sound of wolves in distress, howls of pain and rage that spoke of violence and betrayal. Boone's heart clenched as he recognized Luna's voice among the cries, high and desperate, calling for help that might never come. He ran toward the sound with the ground-eating stride of a man who had once pursued outlaws across impossible terrain. The snow slowed his progress, but couldn't stop him, and his breath came in white puffs as he pushed through drifts that would have turned back a less determined man. The howling continued, growing closer but also weaker, as if the voices were failing one by one. What Boone found when he reached the source of the gunfire was a scene that transported him back to his worst nightmares from his ranger days. 5 men in winter gear stood over the bodies of wolves, their rifles still smoking in the cold air. But these weren't hunters. Their equipment was too professional, their positioning too tactical, their movements too coordinated for anything except military precision. Wolf hunters, bounty killers, who made their living selling pelts and collecting government rewards for eliminating predators that ranchers claimed threatened their livestock. They'd found the pack in a natural clearing and surrounded them with the efficiency of men who had done this before. Many times, Titan lay motionless in the snow, his great body riddled with bullets, his amber eyes staring sightlessly at the grey sky. The younger male had died trying to protect the older female, their bodies intertwined in a final gesture of pack loyalty. Blood stained the pristine snow in expanding circles of crimson that spoke of lives cut short for nothing more than money. But it was what Boone saw next that filled him with a rage so pure it burned away. 3 years of carefully constructed peace. Luna was still alive, wounded and trapped against a fallen log, using her body to shield something small and grey that whimpered with terror and pain. Scout, her son, the pup that Boone had nursed back to health, had grown to love like his own flesh and blood. One of the hunters was approaching Luna with deliberate cruelty, his rifle trained on her head while he savored her helplessness. "This one's got a pup," he called to his companions. "Extra money for breeding pairs. Boss pays double when we can prove we got the whole family. Finish her," another voice replied. "We're behind schedule already." The hunter's finger tightened on the trigger, and Boone felt something snap inside his chest like a breaking dam. The man who had sworn off violence, who had retreated to these mountains to escape the weight of his deadly past, vanished completely. In his place stood Captain Boone Cutter of the Texas Rangers, a man who had never backed down from a fight when innocent lives were at stake. Boone's rifle spoke with authority, the shot echoing across the clearing with finality that silenced every other sound. The hunter who had been about to execute Luna spun and fell, his weapon flying from nerveless fingers as Boone's bullet found its mark with the precision of decades of training. "Rangers," Boone's voice carried across the clearing with the commanding presence that had once made outlaws surrender rather than face him in battle. "Drop your weapons and step away from the wolves." The remaining 4 hunters reacted with the speed of professional killers, swinging their rifles toward this unexpected threat. But they were facing a man who had survived more gunfights than they could imagine, who understood violence in ways that transcended their mercenary brutality. Boone moved through the trees like a ghost, his position shifting constantly as he used every trick learned in 30 years of manhunting. His second shot dropped another hunter before the man could fully turn around. His third caught a killer who thought he was clever enough to flank the unknown threat. The 2 survivors quickly realized they were outmatched. These weren't terrified ranchers or bumbling deputies. They were facing someone who understood warfare at a level that made their professional training look amateur. when Boone's voice came from a completely different position than his last shot, promising death to anyone who didn't surrender immediately. Both men threw down their weapons and raised their hands. "On your knees!" Boone commanded, emerging from cover with his rifle trained on the survivors. "Hands behind your heads!" As the hunters complied, Boone approached Luna with the caution of a man who understood that wounded animals could be unpredictable. But Luna recognized him instantly, her amber eyes lighting with desperate hope as she whimpered a greeting that nearly broke his heart. Scout was alive but badly hurt. A bullet grazed along his ribs that had bled heavily but missed vital organs. The pup looked up at Boone with eyes that held too much pain and terror for something so young, and Boone felt his protective instincts surge with frightening intensity. "Easy, boy," he murmured, gently examining the wound, while Luna watched with the trust of a mother who knew her child was in safe hands. "You're going to be fine, both of you." The two surviving hunters watched this exchange with growing unease. The man who had appeared from nowhere to destroy their operation was now tending to the wolves they'd been hired to kill, and something in his manner suggested that their situation was far more precarious than a simple arrest. "You made a mistake coming here," Boone said, without looking up from Scout's wound. His voice carried the cold certainty of a man who had reached a decision that would change everything. "These wolves are under my protection, have been since the day I took this one in and nursed him back to health." He stood slowly, his rifle held with casual competence that spoke of absolute familiarity with violence. "Now you're going to tell me who hired you and why they wanted this particular pack dead. And you're going to tell me the truth, because I've got all winter to get the answers I need." The transformation was complete. The hermit who had sought peace in the mountains was gone, replaced by the ranger who had never let injustice stand unanswered. The wolves had given Boone a family, and he would protect that family with every skill he had learned in a lifetime of service to the law. Winter was just beginning, and before it ended, there would be a reckoning that would echo through these mountains for years to come. The truth, when it finally came, was uglier than Boone had imagined. The surviving hunters, men named Garrett and Pike, who spoke with the nervous desperation of those who understood. They were facing someone far more dangerous than they'd anticipated, revealed. A conspiracy that reached from the territorial capital all the way to Washington. "D.C., it wasn't just about the bounty money," Garrett stammered as Boone secured their hands with rope from his pack. "There's a railroad company, Northern Pacific Extension, wants to run a line straight through this valley. But they can't get federal approval as long as it's designated wolf habitat." Pike, the older of the two, added details with the reluctant honesty of a man who knew his life hung in the balance. "They hired us to eliminate the pack and make it look like natural predation or disease. No wolves, no habitat protection. The railroad gets their right-of-way, and we get paid enough to retire." Boone felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. "How many other packs have you killed?" "6, Garrett admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 packs across 3 territories. Always made it look like something else. Disease, territorial disputes, accidents. But this pack was different. They were too smart, too organized. We had to use overwhelming force." The scope of the conspiracy staggered Boone. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic extermination designed to clear the way for corporate profit. The wolves he'd come to love, the family that had adopted him, were just obstacles to be removed in service of railroad barons who would never set foot in these mountains. As he questioned the prisoners, Boone worked to save Luna and Scout with the focused intensity of a field surgeon. Luna's wounds were serious but not fatal, bullet grazes and cuts from desperate attempts to protect her son. Scout's injury was healing cleanly, and the pup's natural resilience was already asserting itself as shock gave way to the determined will to survive that marked his kind. But the pack was broken. Titan, the magnificent alpha who had welcomed Boone into their family, lay cold in the snow along with the other adults. Luna and Scout were the sole survivors of a bloodline that had roamed these mountains for generations. and their chances of survival through the winter were slim without the support of pack structure. The realization of what this meant hit Boone like a physical blow. He wasn't just dealing with the murder of wolves. He was confronting the calculated destruction of an entire way of life. The elimination of creatures whose only crime was existing in a place that men in distant cities wanted to exploit. But there was more. As Pike reluctantly revealed additional details, Boone learned that the hunters' orders included eliminating any human witnesses who might interfere with their mission. His intervention hadn't just saved Luna and Scout, it had marked him for death. "There's more men coming," Pike admitted when pressed. "Professional killers, not just hunters. They'll be here within the week, soon as we don't report back on schedule. And they won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way." Boone absorbed this information with the tactical thinking that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work. He was facing a private army funded by railroad money and backed by corrupt government officials. They would come prepared for war, armed with the latest weapons and equipped with intelligence about his location and capabilities. The smart thing would be to pack up immediately and disappear deeper into the mountains, taking Luna and Scout to safety and hoping the killers would eventually give up their search. But Boone found that retirement had not dulled his sense of justice. If anything, his time in the wilderness had sharpened his understanding of what was worth fighting for. These men had murdered an entire wolf family for money. They planned to eliminate every pack in the territory, to clear the way for railroad construction that would destroy the very wilderness that gave these mountains their soul. And they were prepared to kill anyone who stood in their way, including the man who had dared to show compassion to their intended victims. Captain Boone Cutter had faced worse odds and emerged victorious. The question now was whether the hermit who had replaced him had the will to take up arms one final time in defense of the family that had saved his soul. The answer came as he watched Scout struggle to his feet, determination overcoming pain as the young wolf tested his injured leg. Luna nuzzled her son encouragingly, her amber eyes reflecting the fierce maternal instinct that had driven her to seek human help when all seemed lost. These creatures had trusted him with their most precious possession, had welcomed him into their pack despite every instinct that should have kept them apart. He would not abandon them now. Over the next 2 days, Boone transformed his peaceful mountain retreat into a fortress designed to withstand a siege. His years of military training, combined with intimate knowledge of the terrain, gave him advantages that no amount of money could buy. He knew every tree, every rock formation, every game trail that wound through his domain. More importantly, he understood how to turn a defender's natural disadvantages into strategic superiority. He moved his prisoners to a secure location, a natural cave system a mile from his cabin where they could be safely contained without interfering with his preparations. Luna and Scout he relocated to a hidden shelter he constructed deep in the forest, far from any likely line of attack, but close enough for him to check on their recovery. The cabin itself became the centerpiece of an elaborate defensive strategy. Boone prepared multiple firing positions, each with clear fields of fire and protected retreat routes. He cached ammunition and supplies at strategic points throughout his territory, ensuring he could maintain resistance even if his primary position was overrun. Most importantly, he used his understanding of the forest to create obstacles and traps that would channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. But Boone's greatest advantage was something his enemies couldn't anticipate. He was no longer fighting alone. The surviving members of neighboring wolf packs had heard the gunfire and investigated its aftermath. When they found the bodies of Titan's pack and caught Boone's scent at the scene, their reaction was swift and decisive. Word spread through the wolf community with the speed of a forest fire. The human who had been accepted as pack was under threat. The family that had sheltered Luna and Scout was in danger. For creatures who understood loyalty as a fundamental law of existence, The response was automatic and overwhelming. They came from every direction, lone wolves who had been cast out from other packs, mated pairs seeking to establish new territories, even juvenile wolves barely old enough to hunt for themselves. They arrived silently, invisible to human eyes, but unmistakably present to anyone who understood the language of the wilderness. Boone discovered their presence gradually, through subtle signs that spoke of pack coordination on a scale he'd never imagined. Fresh kills appeared near his defensive positions, not gifts, but strategic placement of food that would allow him to maintain his strength during an extended siege. Game trails he'd planned to use for retreat routes showed evidence of recent wolf passage, confirming that his escape paths were being protected. Most remarkably, the wolves began actively scouting for approaching enemies. Their superior senses and intimate knowledge of the forest made them perfect early warning systems, and their ability to communicate across vast distances meant that any hostile approach would be detected long before human eyes could spot the threat. On the third night after the massacre, as Boone sat cleaning his rifle by firelight, he heard a sound that raised goosebumps along his arms. It started as a single howl from somewhere deep in the forest, a call that spoke of anger and determination and the ancient promise that wrongs would be answered. Other voices joined it quickly, until the mountains echoed with a chorus of fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was a declaration of war, sung in harmonies that predated human civilization. The wolves were announcing to any creature within 50 miles that this territory was under their protection, that the human who had shown kindness to their kind was now defended by pack bonds that transcended species. When the sound finally died away, replaced by the profound silence that follows great pronouncements, Boone understood that he was no longer preparing to face his enemies alone. He had an army of his own, wild, fierce, and absolutely committed to defending what they considered family. The railroad killers would come expecting to face one aging ex-ranger in an isolated cabin. Instead, they would encounter something far more dangerous, a man who had rediscovered his purpose fighting alongside creatures who understood warfare at the most primal level. In the distance, carried on the cold winter wind, came answering howls from the territories beyond, other packs acknowledging the call to arms, promising support to wolves they might never meet, but who shared the bonds of species and shared purpose. The mountain war was about to begin, and for the first time since hanging up his badge, Boone Cutter was eager for the fight. They came at dawn on the fourth day, moving through the forest with the confidence of professionals who had never faced serious resistance. 12 men, heavily armed and equipped with military precision, following the trail left by their advance team with the assumption that they would find only bodies and silence. Boone watched them from his primary observation post, a concealed position high above the clearing that offered perfect visibility of all approach routes. Through his spyglass, an old instrument from his ranger days, he studied each man with the tactical assessment that had kept him alive through countless dangerous encounters. Their leader was obvious, a tall man with graying temples who moved with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Military bearing, expensive equipment, and the kind of casual competence that spoke of extensive combat experience. This wasn't some hired gun. This was a professional soldier turned mercenary, probably a former cavalry officer who had found private warfare more profitable than government service. The others were a mix of types Boone recognized from his law enforcement years. Bounty hunters, gunslingers, men who lived by violence and measured their worth in successful kills. They carried repeating rifles, modern weapons that could lay down devastating firepower in sustained engagements. Their clothing and gear spoke of serious financial backing. These men were being paid well for their services, but they made their first mistake within minutes of entering Boone's territory. They approached the cabin directly, assuming that their missing advance team had simply encountered unexpected resistance from a single defender. They had no understanding of the forces arrayed against them. no comprehension that they were walking into a trap designed by someone who understood mountain warfare at levels they couldn't imagine. The wolves struck first. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinated with pack precision that turned individual predators into a unified hunting force. The rear guard went down first, overwhelmed by grey shadows that emerged from the snow-covered underbrush, like ghosts made flesh. Their screams echoed across the clearing, sounds of shock and terror from men who had never imagined becoming prey themselves. The mercenary leader shouted orders, trying to establish defensive positions, but his men were fighting an enemy they couldn't predict or counter. Wolves didn't behave like human opponents. They struck from unexpected angles, used terrain in ways that violated military doctrine, and communicated through methods that rendered conventional tactics useless. Boone waited until the initial chaos reached its peak before adding his voice to the battle. His first shot dropped the mercenary leader, a carefully placed bullet that eliminated command and control with surgical precision. His second and third shots targeted the men with the heaviest weapons, reducing the enemy's firepower advantage before it could be effectively deployed. The surviving mercenaries tried to retreat, but found their escape routes blocked by wolves who had positioned themselves with the strategic thinking of born generals. Every direction led to more enemies, more threats, more reminders that they were no longer the hunters but the hunted. "Surrender your weapons." Boone's voice carried across the clearing with the authority of a man who had commanded respect from both outlaws and lawmen. "You're surrounded and outgunned. Drop your rifles and you'll live to see another sunrise." But these were not men accustomed to surrender. They responded with concentrated fire toward Boone's position, their bullets chipping bark and stone, but finding no flesh as the former ranger moved with the fluid grace of someone who understood that mobility was life in combat situations. The wolf pack responded to this escalation with frightening efficiency. What had been a coordinated attack became something closer to a massacre as creatures who had been holding back their full lethal potential unleashed the primal fury that made them apex predators. The battle reached its crescendo in a chaos of gunfire, howling, and the desperate shouts of men who realized they had gravely underestimated their opposition. Snow kicked up in violent geysers where bullets struck. The pristine white landscape transformed into a battlefield painted with blood and marked by the desperate struggles of those who fought for their lives. Through it all, Boone moved like a ghost through familiar territory, his shots finding targets with the precision that had made him legendary among the rangers. But he wasn't fighting alone. Every move he made was supported by wolves who seemed to anticipate his intentions, who provided covering fire in the form of coordinated attacks that kept enemies off balance and unable to establish effective resistance. The turning point came when the surviving mercenaries attempted to use fire as a weapon, throwing torches toward the areas where they suspected wolves were concealed. It was a desperate tactic that revealed their complete failure to understand their situation. The forest itself seemed to rebel against this threat. Wolves emerged from concealment, not in ones and twos, but in waves that spoke of populations far larger than the mercenaries had imagined. The mountains were alive with predators who had come to defend one of their own, and the sight of dozens of amber eyes reflecting firelight was enough to break the spirit of even the most hardened killers. When the shooting finally stopped, 6 mercenaries lay dead in the snow, and the remaining survivors faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives. The 6 surviving mercenaries knelt in the snow with their hands raised, surrounded by a silent circle of wolves whose amber eyes reflected no mercy. These were not the hired killers who had entered the mountains with such confidence. They were broken, men who had encountered something beyond their understanding or preparation. Boone emerged from the tree line with his rifle held ready, his weathered face showing no emotion as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. Bodies lay scattered across the clearing, dark stains spreading through the pristine snow where men had fallen to wolf fangs and ranger bullets. The professional army sent to eliminate a single hermit had been destroyed by forces they never could have anticipated. "You have one chance to live through this," Boone said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who had reached the limits of his patience. "You're going to tell me everything. Who hired you, how much they paid, what other operations they have planned. And you're going to give me written confessions that will stand up in any court of law." The senior surviving mercenary, a man named Crawford, who wore sergeant stripes on his winter coat, looked around at his decimated force with the stunned expression of someone whose world had just collapsed. "You can't be serious. You're just one man." His words were cut off by a low growl from the massive black wolf standing closest to him. The creature's lips were pulled back to reveal fangs that could crush a man's skull, and there was no doubt that only Boone's presence was preventing immediate violence. "I'm not just one man," Boone corrected quietly. "I'm Pack, and you just declared war on my family." Over the next hour, the full scope of the conspiracy emerged through interrogation that was both methodical and merciless. The Northern Pacific Extension Railroad had hired a private military company to eliminate wolf populations across 3 territories, clearing the way for construction that would require federal approval. The operation was funded through corporate accounts designed to hide the source of payments, overseen by politicians who would profit from railroad contracts, and executed by men who viewed murder as simply another business transaction. But the mercenaries had been told they were facing isolated homesteaders and scattered wolf packs, not a former Texas Ranger with 30 years of combat experience and the backing of every wolf pack within 100 miles. Their intelligence had been fatally flawed, their assumptions lethally wrong. Crawford's confession, written in shaking handwriting, while wolves watched his every movement. Detailed meeting sites, payment schedules, and the names of officials who had authorized the extermination campaign. It was evidence that would bring down careers and send men to prison if it could be delivered to honest authorities. "There's a federal marshal in Denver," Crawford offered desperately. "Marshal Harrison. He's not part of this. He's been asking questions about missing wolves, making trouble for the company. If you could get word to him." "I'll get word to him," Boone promised grimly. "But first, you're going to help me make sure this ends here and now." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. Crawford would return to his employers with news that the mission had been successful. The hermit was dead, the wolves eliminated, the territory cleared for railroad development. He would collect the final payment and deliver it, along with his written confession and all supporting evidence, to Marshal Harrison in Denver. The other survivors would remain as prisoners until Crawford's mission was complete. Guarantees that he would fulfill his part of the bargain, rather than simply disappearing with advance payment money. If Crawford betrayed the agreement, the remaining mercenaries would face justice from creatures who understood loyalty better than any human court. But the most crucial element of the plan involved Luna and Scout, the mother and pup, who had started this entire chain of events, would accompany Crawford to Denver, living proof that the wolf population had not been eliminated and that federal protection was still necessary. Their presence would validate every word of Crawford's testimony and provide irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy's scope. It was a dangerous gambit that required trust between species that had been enemies for generations. But as Boone knelt beside Luna and Scout, explaining in gentle tones what he was asking of them, the wolf mother's amber eyes showed understanding that transcended language barriers. She had sought his help once before when her son was dying. Now he was asking for her help to ensure that no other wolf families would face the same threat that had destroyed her pack. The choice was hers, but Boone could see in her expression that she understood the stakes involved. Luna's answer came in the form of a soft whine and a gentle touch of her nose against Boone's hand. She would go. She would trust this human who had become packed to protect not just her and Scout, but all the wild families that called these mountains home. as preparations began for the most important journey any of them would ever make. The circle of wolves that had defended Boone's territory began to disperse. But their message had been delivered with unmistakable clarity. These mountains were protected by bonds stronger than money, loyalty deeper than corporate greed. The railroad barons had learned what the outlaws of an earlier era had discovered. Some things were worth fighting for, and some men would never stop fighting to protect them. Spring came early to Elkshade Forest that year, bringing news that traveled faster than the melting snow through mountain passes and valley settlements. The Northern Pacific Extension Railroad had collapsed in a scandal that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. Federal marshals had arrested dozens of officials on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder, and the evidence provided by a reformed mercenary and two wolves had been front-page news in papers from Denver to New York. Boone read about it in a letter from Marshal Harrison, delivered by Sam McCready during his first trading visit since the winter's events. The old trader had brought more than just news. He'd carried word that Boone Cutter was no longer a hermit hiding from his past, but a legend whose defense of wolf territory had captured the imagination of a nation hungry for stories of justice and redemption. "They're calling you the Wolf Ranger," Sam said with obvious pride as they shared coffee on Boone's porch. "There's talk of making this whole area a federal preserve, protected from any kind of development. And there's been inquiries, official ones, about whether you might consider coming back to law enforcement." Boone smiled as he watched Scout, now grown into a magnificent young wolf, playing with Luna in the clearing. The pup who had arrived at death's door 8 months ago was larger than his mother, his silver-gray coat gleaming with health and his amber eyes bright with intelligence and mischief. The bond between them remained strong, but it was the bond of equals now. Mother and son ready to face whatever challenges the wild world might offer. "I appreciate the offers," Boone replied, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. "But I've got responsibilities here. Family obligations." Luna looked up at the sound of his voice, her amber eyes reflecting the same warmth and trust that had developed during their shared trials. She approached the porch with the confident stride of a wolf who knew she was welcome, carrying something in her mouth that made Boone's breath catch with wonder. It was a tiny pup, barely weeks old, silver-gray fur still soft with youth, but already showing the distinctive markings that would identify it as Scout's offspring. Luna placed the small creature gently at Boone's feet, then stepped back with the satisfied expression of a grandmother presenting her latest grandchild. "Well, I'll be," Sam whispered. Luna found herself a mate after all. Boone knelt carefully and extended his hand toward the pup, who sniffed his fingers with the fearless curiosity that seemed to run in the family. Behind Luna, he could see movement in the tree line. A magnificent male wolf with darker fur and watchful eyes, Scout's father-in-law and Luna's new partner. The pack was rebuilding itself, creating new bonds and new hope for the future. "Looks like you're going to be a grandfather of sorts," Sam observed with amusement. "Think you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" The pup chose that moment to tumble forward and climb onto Boone's boot, its tiny claws scrambling for purchase as it attempted to scale what must have seemed like an enormous mountain. The sight was so endearing that both men couldn't help but laugh, and even Luna made a sound that could only be described as lupine amusement. "I reckon I'll manage," Boone said, gently scooping up the adventurous pup and cradling it against his chest. "After all, I've had some experience with raising wolves over the following weeks." As spring transformed the mountains into a paradise of wildflowers and rushing streams, Boone discovered that his reputation had brought unexpected changes to his previously isolated existence. Wildlife researchers arrived to study the pack dynamics that had developed around his cabin. Federal officials came to discuss the establishment of the Elkshade Wolf Preserve. Even former rangers made pilgrimages to visit the man who had traded his badge for something more valuable, the trust and loyalty of creatures who asked nothing more than the chance to live free, but perhaps the most meaningful visit came from an unexpected source. A young woman named Emily Harper, niece of the schoolteacher whose death had driven Boone into exile, arrived one afternoon with a letter from her family. "They wanted you to know," she said, as they sat watching Scout teach his offspring the basics of pack hierarchy, "that they forgave you long ago. Aunt Emily's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. She would have been proud of what you've done here, protecting creatures who can't protect themselves." The letter she carried contained words that lifted a weight from Boone's shoulders that he'd carried for 3 years. The Harper family had established a scholarship in their daughter's memory, funding education for children in frontier communities, and they wanted Boone to know that his efforts to protect the wolves had inspired them to expand the program. "She loved all living things," Emily explained. "Aunt Emily used to say that the measure of a person wasn't in the mistakes they made, but in how they chose to make amends. I think she would say, 'You've made beautiful amends.'" As summer settled over the mountains and the new pup grew strong enough to explore beyond the clearing, Boone found himself thinking often about the strange journey that had brought him to this place. He'd come to these mountains seeking solitude and escape, but had instead discovered family, purpose, and redemption in forms he never could have imagined. The old leather pouch that had once held his ranger badge now served as a toy for the newest member of the pack, just as it had for Scout. But it no longer represented a failed past. It had become a symbol of transformation, of the endless possibility for growth and change that existed for anyone willing to open their heart to unexpected grace. The pine tree that Luna had gifted him had grown tall and strong, its branches reaching toward the sky with the same determination that had brought a desperate mother wolf to his door on that distant morning when everything changed. In its shade, Boone would sit each evening, watching his adopted family live their wild lives, while knowing that he had played a part in ensuring those lives would continue. Some called him the Wolf Ranger now, but Boone preferred a simpler title: pack member, family, friend to creatures who had taught him that the greatest battles were indeed fought with kindness, and that the deepest healing came from the most unexpected places. The mountains kept their secrets, but they had shared one with a broken man who had proven worthy of their trust. In protecting the wolves, he had saved himself. In finding his pack, he had found his way home.